And the Lord came and stood there and said, calling as before, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel said, Speak, for your servant is listening. Then the Lord said to Samuel, See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make both ears of anyone who hears it tingle. On that day I will fulfill against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house from beginning to end, for I have told him that I am about to punish his house forever for the iniquity that he knew, because his sons were blaspheming God, and he did not restrain them. Therefore I swear to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be expiated by sacrifice or offering forever. Samuel lay there until morning. Then he opened the doors of the house of the Lord. Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli. But Eli called Samuel and said, Samuel, my son. He said, Here I am. Eli said, What was it that he told you? Do not hide it from me. May God do so to you and more also, if you hide anything from me of all that he told you. So Samuel told him everything and hid nothing from him. Then Eli said, It is the Lord. Let him do what he thinks good to him. As Samuel grew up, the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was a trustworthy prophet of the Lord. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord. And the word of Samuel came to all Israel. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
If you're looking for something consistent between people of Bible times and people of our times, it's that we have trouble listening. That's not something new we came up with. It's always been the case with God's people. We're doing better with hearing. Modern science is helping us to be able to hear better. But we're still struggling with listening. Sally and I have a niece who was born deaf. She fortunately had a few living auditory nerve endings, and so it looks like, is going to be able to hear. She has been given the gift of cochlear implants, and those seem to be working, and they're starting to see some progress, and that she will one day probably be able to hear pretty well. We give thanks to God for that, and for the scientists and the doctors and therapists who are making that possible. But what I haven't told my brother-in-law and sister-in-law yet is just because she can hear won't necessarily mean she'll be able to listen. Find the doctor who can fix that. That's our issue, right? I mean, those of us who can hear still struggle with listening, and it's not just a modern issue. God's been dealing with this for a long, long time. God is waiting for that doctor to fix the listening part. Maybe the modern slant is that we undervalue listening. We don't sense the value in it the way we probably should. We've created, we produce, we seek out, we pay for, we turn on all sorts of noises to fill our empty space. If it's quiet for just a few minutes, we push some button to fill that space. We just aren't comfortable with quiet. We don't seek out environments that are conducive to listening. Most of our restaurants these days have what in every corner? Televisions. Many families make their family meal right in front of a television. I wonder how we can digest food with some of the things that we hear while we're trying to have our meals. And I've said this kind of thing to you before, but it just seems so important to me. I don't know that we can develop the capacity to hear God if we haven't developed the capacity to hear each other. Paraphrase maybe something 1 John would say, if we can't hear those we can see and be around and care about, how can we hear the God we don't see? If we haven't learned enough to hear each other, to listen to each other, how are we going to listen well to God? You may have noticed, I hear there's some sort of presidential contest going on right now. Matt's pleased for the revenues coming to the people. All kinds of commercials going on. I watch these people in their debates, and I think they're pretty good at speaking. Doesn't seem that too many of them care about listening. There's a whole lot of talking, not a whole lot of listening. I long for the candidate who will say his platform is "I listen well." But I know that we'll say that is nice, that is good. We want you on our city council. But we need a leader for president. We don't need someone who can listen. We need someone who can lead. I think if they said, "I listen to God," well, we'd say, "Great. We want you as president of our Sunday school class." Because we've observed, sadly, rightly, that people who say, "God told me to do this," when they have the kind of power a president has, can end up doing all kinds of harm. People who've claimed in the past some kind of divine right to do what they want to do are real good about thinking they've heard what God has said and not real good about listening to others say, "I heard God say something a little bit different than that." So we're cautious about anyone who would say, "God told me to, and I'm president, so I can do it." But I wonder, even if that's not what we want out of our president, if it is not what we need out of our people in faith, the ability to listen, the importance of listening. Real leadership may not look to some like people who listen, but real faith, I think, requires it. I think part of the baptized life, part of living out our faith, is developing the capacity to listen. It's been the call since the very beginning for people of faith. Since the very beginning, it has been the call that we listen to God. And when you came around to Jesus' time, he often said, "Listen." He often introduced what he was about to say with, "Listen. I'm about to tell you something significant. Listen." He'd say, "Listen and understand." He would say, "Those who have ears to hear, hear." What he wasn't saying is, if you have these outer noise receptors, then take in the information. He was saying, take it in and then live accordingly. That's the difference between hearing and listening. Lots of people can hear things. The question is, will we hear it and then live accordingly? Will we listen? If I tell somebody to do something and they don't do it, and I say, "Did you hear me?" they could rightly say, "Yes, I heard you." If Jesus tells us to do something and we say, "We heard you," but didn't do it, well, that does him no good. What Jesus was interested in is if we listen. Did you hear me, and did you respond accordingly? Of course, to listen requires that we're able to hear. Now, I don't think Jesus could hold us accountable for things he didn't say that we might hear. In other words, if he called his disciples together and said, "I have this teaching for you," and then never actually told it to them, well, how could they be held accountable? But on the other hand, if he's giving these teachings and his disciples never put themselves in a position to hear them, well, maybe they hold some responsibility too. If Jesus was out saying, "These are the things I want you to do," and they were often away from him, not in places to hear him say, "These are the things I want you to do," maybe the disciples too were at fault. We've read from this famous story from 1 Samuel about Eli and Samuel and sort of the passing of the torch. Eli has been the priest for some time there at Shiloh, and he's been the one that people turn to and look to and expected to be the priest. And it's not by accident it talks about how the light had not yet gone out, but how he could hardly see. There's this dimming effect that's going on with Eli's leadership. It says the word of the Lord was rare in those days. And you have to wonder how much it was that God wasn't speaking, how much it was that people weren't listening. What caused the word of the Lord to be rare? Well, Eli's house was failing. The sons, who would be the rightful heirs of the priesthood, the ones you would assume would take on the leadership, they've got the pedigree, they've got the training, they're the people with the name recognition, they're the ones who seem like they're going to be the new priests. Well, they're not acting like they're trying to get the job. They're taking the sacrifices for their own personal benefit, not for God's benefit, not for the benefit of those who are making it. They abuse their power with women. In the next chapter after one we read, they will allow the Ark of the Covenant, this representation of God's presence, to be stolen. These are bad priests. So 1 Samuel, starting the end of Eli's tenure and the beginning of Samuel. Samuel's presented the opposite way. He's childlike in his faith and devotion. He hears what he thinks is Eli call, and he runs like it's his daddy. In fact, the translation I noticed you read, Eleanor, said, "Son, go back to bed." There's this kind of father-son type relationship, and he runs as soon as he hears any voice. What can I do for you? I'm here, I'm here. 3 times he does this, and finally Eli says, maybe God's speaking to you. Go back and listen for that. And he goes back, and he listens, and he hears, and even though it's a word he doesn't want to say to Eli, he gives it to him because that's the word he was given. And he'll grow up and he'll become a prophet, and he'll challenge Saul and all of Israel to listen and to obey, to hear and live accordingly. That combination of what listening truly is. But as I said to the children, he would not be in a position to listen had he not placed himself or been placed by his mother in that spot. His mother, who had prayed for a son, she had been mournful over her barrenness and prayed, if God, if you'll give me a son, I will dedicate him to your service. I will consecrate him to your service. In fact, she commits, as soon as he is weaned, he will be yours. It's like it's saying, as soon as she could possibly turn him over to the tabernacle, to Eli's service, he was. And there he was, and he was wanting so badly to be in God's presence. He slept as near to the ark as he possibly could. He wanted to be with God, and it was his desire to be with God and his presence with God that allowed him to hear that rare word that everyone else seemed to be missing. He put himself in a position to hear God's voice, to hear God's word. And what I'm wondering is, have we developed the capacity to hear God's word the way Samuel did? Are we doing the things that cut out those noises, that cut out those distractions, that put us in a place as near to God as we can possibly be to hear God's word in days when it seems like it's rare that God is speaking? Now, I know that's tough. It's tough for me. I am not good at that. I'm real good at filling myself with all kinds of what seems like important, busy work to do. I can go from sun up to sundown doing things that you would say, those are good things for a pastor to do. And the whole day long, I could have missed out on the most important thing that it would be good for a leader of a congregation to do, and that is try to sit down and listen for God's word. I was with a group of ministers this week. We had a little clergy prayer deal, and in that we were given 10 minutes of silence to try and still ourselves and listen to God. And 8 of those 10 minutes, I was having to click off little boxes in my head, the way you do in a computer when you're shutting down programs. I was having to go by and put that to bed, put that down, deal with that. And finally, 8 minutes into it, I'm trying now to listen to God. That's the way it is in our lives, and it's not just me, it's all of us. We have a hard time making that space for God, and so I'm going to challenge each of us to try to carve out that space, wherever it is that you think can be a